December 16, 1944. Dawn breaks over the snow-covered Ardennes forest, a dense wilderness straddling the borders of Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. For months, the forest has been a quiet sector of the Western Front. Allied commanders dismiss it as impassable for large-scale armor, a place where exhausted GIs can rest before the final push into the fatherland. But in the pre-dawn darkness, 250,000 German soldiers, 1,200 tanks, and 2,600 artillery pieces lie in wait, hidden by the trees and the fog. This is Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine, Adolf Hitler's last desperate offensive to turn the tide of World War II. At the vanguard of the attack is Kampfgruppe Peiper, elite force of 4,800 SS troops led by 29-year-old Colonel Joachim Peiper, one of the Wehrmacht's most decorated and feared commanders. Peiper's reputation is built on brutality and speed. He led the spearhead of the German advance in France in 1940, captured hundreds of Allied soldiers in North Africa, and earned the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds for his exploits on the Eastern Front. Now, Hitler has hand-picked him to punch a hole through the Allied lines, seize the vital port of Antwerp, and split the British and American armies in two. But as Peiper stands in the turret of his Command Tiger II tank, his face grim beneath his fur-lined hat, he knows his greatest enemy is not the American soldiers ahead, it is fuel. Germany's oil production has collapsed under years of Allied bombing. By December 1944, the Wehrmacht is receiving just 33 million barrels of oil annually, less than 2% of the 1.8 billion barrels the United States is producing each year. Peiper's Kampfgruppe has been allocated a mere 30,000 gallons of gasoline for the entire offensive, enough to drive his tanks 120 miles at most. "We will advance on fumes," he tells his officers, "but we will advance. Antwerp is ours." The German High Command shares his confidence, at least publicly. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, has assured Hitler that the offensive will catch the Allies napping, and that captured Allied supplies will sustain the advance. The Americans waste fuel like water, Jodl argues. "We will take what we need from them." For Peiper and his men, this is more than a battle, it is a bet on survival. If they fail, Germany will have no more reserves to defend itself. If they succeed, they might just buy time for a negotiated peace. But what Peiper and the entire German High Command do not realize, as their tanks roar forward into the Ardennes that morning, is that the very supply they are counting on to win the battle will soon become the proof of their inevitable defeat. Just 3 days later, in the small Belgian town of Honsfeld, Peiper will stumble upon an abandoned American fuel depot containing 50,000 gallons of gasoline, more than most German divisions receive in 6 months. At first, it will feel like a miracle, a stroke of luck that could turn the tide of the offensive. But as Peiper stares at the endless rows of fuel drums, a cold truth will sink in: Germany is not fighting a war against an army. It is fighting a war against an industrial juggernaut that could afford to abandon more fuel than Germany could produce in a year. This is the story of that fateful discovery, the moment when a single cache of gasoline exposed the gaping chasm between German ambition and American industrial might, and when one of Germany's most ruthless commanders realized that the war was already lost. To understand the significance of Peiper's discovery at Honsfeld, we must first confront the desperate reality that led Hitler to launch the Ardennes offensive. By the winter of 1944, Germany was a nation on the brink of collapse. The Red Army was advancing relentlessly from the east, having pushed the Wehrmacht back across Poland and into East Prussia. In the west, Allied forces had liberated France and Belgium, and were massing along the German border, preparing for a final assault on the Rhineland. But the greatest threat to Germany was not the Allied armies, it was the crippling shortage of oil. Oil was the lifeblood of modern warfare, powering tanks, planes, trucks, and artillery. Without it, the Wehrmacht was a paper tiger. Germany had never been self-sufficient in oil. Before the war, it imported 80% of its petroleum from Romania and the Soviet Union. But by 1944, those supplies had dried up. The Red Army had captured Romania's Ploiești oil fields, the largest in Europe. In August 1944, and Allied bombers had destroyed most of Germany's synthetic oil plants, which had been producing 80% of the country's fuel. The numbers were catastrophic. In 1943, Germany produced 83 million barrels of oil, synthetic and natural combined. By 1944, that number had plummeted to 33 million barrels. The United States, by contrast, produced 1.8 billion barrels in 1944, enough to supply its own military and lend millions more to Britain and the Soviet Union. The result was a logistics crisis that paralyzed the Wehrmacht. By December 1944, most German panzer divisions were operating at just 50% of their authorized fuel levels. Tanks sat idle in depots, planes were grounded, and infantry units were forced to march on foot because their trucks had no gasoline. Hitler's solution was Operation Watch on the Rhine, a bold, almost suicidal offensive designed to seize the port of Antwerp and cut off the Allied supply lines. Antwerp was the largest port in Western Europe, and by 1944, it was handling 60% of all Allied supplies bound for the Western Front. If Germany could capture Antwerp, the Allies would be forced to halt their advance, giving Hitler time to rebuild his forces and negotiate a peace treaty. But the plan was based on a fatal assumption, that German forces could advance 100 miles through the Ardennes in just 4 days, seizing Allied fuel depots along the way to sustain themselves. Hitler was convinced that the Allies were overextended and demoralized, and that a sudden attack would throw them into chaos. The Americans are soft, he told his generals. They cannot withstand the fury of the German soldier. We will take their fuel, their weapons, and their will to fight. The task of leading the main thrust fell to the 6th Panzer Army, commanded by SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, a close ally of Hitler's. Dietrich's best unit was Kampfgruppe Peiper, named for its commander, Joachim Peiper. Peiper's force was an elite formation, consisting of 4,800 SS Panzergrenadiers, elite infantry. 60 Tiger II tanks, the most powerful tanks of the war, armed with 88 mm cannons. 40 Panzer IV tanks. 30 self-propelled artillery pieces. 120 trucks and half-tracks. But even this elite force was hamstrung by fuel shortages. Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe was allocated just 30,000 gallons of gasoline for the offensive, enough to drive his tanks to Antwerp and back, but only if they did not encounter heavy resistance. We will have to live off the land, Peiper told his adjutant, Captain Werner Pochk. Every Allied fuel depot we capture is a lifeline. Without it, we die. The Allied command, for its part, was caught completely off guard. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, had predicted a German counterattack, but he believed it would come in the north, near Aachen, not in the Ardennes. The sector was defended by 4 American divisions, the 28th Infantry Division, a National Guard unit from Pennsylvania, the 106th Infantry Division, a Green unit seeing its first combat, the 99th Infantry Division, and the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, a veteran unit. But these divisions were spread thin, covering a 80-mile front with just 83,000 men, less than half the number of German troops attacking them. On the morning of December 16, 1944, the German artillery opened fire. For 2 hours, 2,600 guns pounded the American lines, flattening foxholes, destroying communication lines, and sowing chaos. Then, the tanks rolled forward. Peiper's Kampfgruppe led the charge, smashing through the 106th Infantry Division's defenses and advancing 10 miles on the first day. The Americans, caught off guard, fell back in disarray. For Peiper and his men, it seemed like Hitler's gamble was paying off. But as the sun set on December 16, Peiper's fuel gauges were already dropping. His tanks had burned through 10,000 gallons of gasoline in just 12 hours, 1/3 of his total allocation. We need to find fuel, and fast, he radioed Dietrich. Otherwise, we'll be stuck here before we reach the Meuse. The race for fuel had begun. And in the small Belgian town of Honsfeld, just a few miles ahead, the prize, and the curse, awaited. December 19, 1944. 3 days into the offensive, Peiper's Kampfgruppe is bogged down. What was supposed to be a lightning advance has turned into a slog. The American 28th Infantry Division has put up fierce resistance at the town of Kampfgruppe, delaying Peiper's tanks for 18 hours. The narrow forest roads are clogged with disabled vehicles and supply trucks, slowing his advance to a crawl. Worst of all, his fuel is nearly gone. His tanks have just 5,000 gallons left, enough to drive 20 miles at most. "We're not going to make it to the Meuse like this," Peiper growls to Pochk as they study a map in the turret of his Tiger II. "We need to find an Allied supply depot, now." At that moment, a scout unit radioed in. They had captured a group of American soldiers near the town of Honsfeld, and under interrogation, one of the GIs had revealed the location of an abandoned fuel depot on the outskirts of the town. The depot, the soldier said, was being used to supply the 28th Infantry Division, and it contained hundreds of barrels of gasoline. Peiper's eyes lit up. "That's our lifeline," he said. "Tell the tanks to move out, full speed to Honsfeld." Honsfeld was a small, picturesque town of 1,200 people, nestled in a valley in the Ardennes. Before the war, it was a popular destination for skiers and hikers. But by December 19, 1944, it was a ghost town. The American troops stationed there had fled in the face of Peiper's advance, leaving behind their weapons, supplies, and vehicles. As Peiper's tanks rumbled into the town, they encountered no resistance, only empty streets and abandoned jeeps. The fuel depot was located on the western edge of Honsfeld, in a field next to a railway line. When Peiper arrived, he could hardly believe his eyes. Rows upon rows of 55-gallon fuel drums stretched as far as the eye could see. There were jeeps, trucks, and half-tracks parked nearby, their fuel tanks still full. A team of German soldiers quickly counted the drums, 909 barrels, totaling 50,000 gallons of high-octane gasoline, more than Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe had been allocated for the entire offensive, and more than most German divisions received in 6 months. For a moment, the German soldiers erupted in celebration. They had been marching on fumes for 3 days, sleeping in freezing tanks and subsisting on rations of bread and sausage. Now, they had hit the jackpot. "We're saved," one soldier shouted, pumping his fist in the air. "On to Antwerp." Peiper climbed down from his tank and walked among the drums, his boots crunching in the snow. At first, he shared his men's elation. This was exactly what they had come for, captured fuel to keep their advance alive. He ordered his trucks to start loading the drums, and his mechanics to siphon gasoline from the abandoned American vehicles. For the first time in 3 days, his tank's fuel gauges began to rise. But as he stood there, staring at the mountain of fuel, a cold, creeping doubt began to settle in. He thought about the numbers, 50,000 gallons. The Americans had abandoned 50,000 gallons of gasoline like it was nothing. They had fled so quickly that they hadn't even had time to destroy the depot, something any army would do to deny supplies to the enemy. Why? Because they could afford to. Because 50,000 gallons was a drop in the bucket compared to the millions of gallons the American military was producing every day. Peiper thought back to his own supply situation. His Kampfgruppe, one of the best-equipped units in the Wehrmacht, had started the offensive with just 30,000 gallons of fuel. Most German panzer divisions were operating on even less. The 12th SS Panzer Division, fighting alongside him, had been forced to leave 20% of its tanks behind because there was no gasoline to transport them. Yet here, the Americans had abandoned more fuel than a German division could use in half a year. He thought about the synthetic oil plants back in Germany, bombed into ruins by Allied B-17s. He thought about the Romanian oil fields, now in Soviet hands. He thought about the endless convoys of American ships bringing fuel, weapons, and supplies to Europe, convoys that the German U-boats could no longer stop. For the first time, the full scale of Germany's predicament hit him. This was not a war of tactics or strategy. It was a war of production. And Germany was losing, badly. Captain Pochk walked up to him, a grin on his face. "Colonel, we're ready to move out. With this fuel, we can reach the Meuse by tomorrow." Peiper turned to him, his face now expressionless. Ready to move out, he repeated quietly. Or ready to participate in our own funeral. Poch's grin faded. Sir. Peiper gestured at the fuel drums. They left this here because they don't need it. They can make more than we could ever dream of. We capture 50,000 gallons, and we think it's a victory. But it's not. It's a reminder of how hopeless our situation is. That night, Peiper wrote in his diary, "Today, we captured 50,000 gallons of American gasoline. It should have been the greatest day of the offensive. Instead, it was the worst. Because I realized, as I stood among those drums, that we are not fighting an enemy. We are fighting a force of nature, one that cannot be stopped. This war is already lost." The next morning, Peiper's Kampfgruppe resumed its advance, now fueled by the captured gasoline. But the elation was gone. The soldiers could sense the change in their commander. His once relentless drive had been replaced by a quiet, grim determination. They advanced 15 miles that day, reaching the town of Stavelot, but the momentum was already slipping. The Americans, now fully alerted to the offensive, were rushing reinforcements to the Ardennes. And Peiper's greatest fear was about to come true: the captured fuel would not be enough. The capture of the Honsfeld fuel depot gave Peiper's Kampfgruppe a temporary reprieve, but it was not a solution. The 50,000 gallons of gasoline allowed him to advance to Stavelot, but by December 21, his tanks were once again running low. The problem was simple: the Ardennes offensive had turned into a larger battle than Hitler had anticipated, and Peiper's Kampfgruppe was consuming fuel at a rate far beyond what even the captured depot could sustain. Each Tiger II tank burned 10 gallons of gasoline per mile. A single day of hard fighting, with tanks moving, firing, and maneuvering, could consume 500 gallons per tank. Peiper's 60 Tiger IIs alone were burning 30,000 gallons per day. The 40 Panzer IVs and 120 trucks added another 20,000 gallons per day. Even with the 50,000 gallons from Honsfeld, Peiper's fuel would last just one day of heavy combat. And there was no more fuel to capture. The Americans, now aware of Peiper's reliance on captured supplies, were destroying their depots before retreating. At Stavelot, Peiper's scouts found a small fuel cache, just 2,000 gallons, but it was barely enough to keep his tanks moving. Compounding the fuel crisis was the growing American resistance. The 101st Airborne Division had been rushed to the town of Bastogne, where they were surrounded by German forces but refused to surrender. General Anthony McAuliffe, the division's commander, famously replied, "Nuts," to the German surrender demand, and his troops held out for 5 days until relieved by General George Patton's Third Army. The 101 St stand at Bastogne slowed the entire German advance, giving the Allies time to reinforce the Ardennes. At Stavelot, Peiper's Kampfgruppe encountered fierce resistance from the American 30th Infantry Division, a veteran unit known as the Old Hickory Division. The 30th had been rushed to the Ardennes from Aachen, and they dug in along the banks of the Amblève River, blocking Peiper's path to the Meuse. For 3 days, Peiper's tanks attacked the American positions, but the 30th held firm. Each attack consumed more fuel, and each failed attack brought Peiper closer to running out. On December 23, the weather cleared, a disaster for the Germans. For the first week of the offensive, heavy fog and snow had grounded Allied aircraft, giving the German tanks free rein to advance. But on December 23, the sun came out, and the Allied air forces launched a massive assault. Hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs roared over the Ardennes, bombing and strafing German tanks, trucks, and supply lines. Peiper's fuel trucks, which were struggling to bring up the last of the Honsfeld gasoline, were easy targets. By the end of the day, half of his fuel trucks had been destroyed. That night, Peiper received a radio message from Dietrich: "No more fuel is available. You must hold your position or withdraw." Peiper knew that holding his position was impossible. His tanks had less than 3,000 gallons of gasoline left, enough to move 6 miles, but not enough to fight. The Americans were closing in from 3 sides, and the Allied Air Force was bombing his positions relentlessly. He had no choice but to retreat. On December 24, Christmas Eve, Peiper ordered his men to destroy their remaining tanks and artillery. They could not carry the heavy weapons back through the forest, and they did not want to leave them for the Americans. The soldiers set fire to their Tiger IIs, their Panzer IVs, and their artillery pieces, watching as the flames lit up the night sky. Then, they began the long, cold march back to German lines, carrying only their weapons and whatever rations they could scavenge. The retreat was a nightmare. The soldiers marched through knee-deep snow, under constant attack from Allied aircraft and patrols. Many were wounded or frostbitten. By the time Peiper's Kampfgruppe reached German lines on December 27, only 1,200 of the original 4,800 men remained. They had lost 60 tanks, 30 artillery pieces, and 120 trucks. The Ardennes offensive had failed. As Peiper stood in the snow, watching his surviving men stumble into the German trenches, he thought back to Honsfeld. The 50,000 gallons of gasoline had been a temporary lifeline, but it had also been a wake-up call. It had exposed the fundamental truth of the war: Germany could not compete with America's industrial might. The United States could produce more fuel in a day than Germany could produce in a month. It could replace lost tanks, planes, and trucks faster than Germany could build them. This was not a war Germany could ever win. Years later, in an interview with historians, Peiper would recall the discovery at Honsfeld with bitter clarity, finding that fuel depot was the worst thing that could have happened to us. It made me realize that we were not fighting a war, we were participating in our own funeral. The Americans had so much, and we had so little. There was no way to overcome that gap. The war was lost the moment we crossed into the Ardennes. The story of Peiper's discovery at Honsfeld is not just a story of one man's realization, it is a microcosm of the entire war in Europe. The Ardennes offensive was Hitler's last, desperate attempt to overcome a logistics gap that had been widening since the day the United States entered the war. By 1944, that gap was so large that it was insurmountable. To understand the scale of America's logistics superiority, we must look at the numbers that would have been unimaginable to Peiper and the German High Command. Oil was the most critical commodity of World War II, and the United States dominated its production. In 1944, the U.S. produced 1.8 billion barrels of oil, more than the rest of the world combined. Germany, by contrast, produced just 33 million barrels that year. That meant the U.S. was producing 54 times more oil than Germany. The impact of this gap was staggering. The U.S. Army alone consumed 300 million barrels of oil in 1944, nearly 10 times Germany's total annual production. American tanks, planes, and trucks had an endless supply of fuel, allowing them to operate at full capacity. German forces, by contrast, were constantly rationing fuel. By December 1944, the Wehrmacht was allocating just 2,000 gallons of gasoline per panzer division per week. The U.S. Third Army, by comparison, consumed 500,000 gallons of gasoline per day. The U.S. could even afford to waste fuel to deny it to the enemy. During the Ardennes offensive, American units frequently destroyed their fuel depots when threatened by German advances. At Honsfeld, the Americans abandoned 50,000 gallons without a second thought, because they knew they could replace it within days. For Germany, 50,000 gallons was a strategic asset. For the U.S., it was a trivial loss. Oil was just one part of the equation. The United States also outproduced Germany in every major weapons system. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. built 88,410 tanks and self-propelled artillery pieces, 324,750 aircraft, 5,425 ships, 41 billion rounds of ammunition. Germany, during the same period, built 46,857 tanks and self-propelled artillery pieces, 113,514 aircraft, 1,162 ships, 21 billion rounds of ammunition. The U.S. was building tanks at a rate of 240 per day, more than Germany built in a week. American factories were so productive that the U.S. military could afford to replace lost equipment faster than it was destroyed. During the Ardennes offensive, the U.S. lost 733 tanks, but it built 1,200 tanks that month, meaning it actually increased its tank strength while fighting a major battle. Germany, by contrast, lost 554 tanks during the offensive and built just 300 that month, leaving it with a net loss of 254 tanks. This manufacturing superiority meant that the U.S. could sustain a war of attrition, while Germany could not. The more Germany fought, the weaker it became. The more the U.S. fought, the stronger it became. Even if Germany had been able to produce enough oil and weapons, it would have struggled to get them to the front lines. The Allied bombing campaign had destroyed Germany's railway network, making it nearly impossible to transport supplies from factories to the battlefield. By 1944, 90% of Germany's major railway bridges had been destroyed, and 70% of its locomotives were out of service. The U.S., by contrast, had a logistics network that was the envy of the world. The Red Ball Express, the same supply convoy that had defeated the Wehrmacht in France in 1944, was now operating at full capacity, delivering 12,500 tons of supplies per day to the Western Front. The U.S. also had the advantage of the port of Antwerp, which could handle 100,000 tons of supplies per day, enough to sustain 1 million troops. During the Ardennes offensive, the U.S. logistics system proved its resilience. Even though the German advance had cut some supply lines, the Allies were able to reroute supplies through other ports and airfields. By December 25, the U.S. was delivering 80,000 tons of supplies per day to the Ardennes, enough to keep the American armies fighting at full strength. Germany's logistics system, by contrast, collapsed under the strain of the offensive. The narrow forest roads were clogged with vehicles, and Allied aircraft destroyed thousands of supply trucks. By the end of December 1944, the Wehrmacht was delivering just 2,000 tons of supplies per day to the Ardennes, less than 3% of what the Allies were delivering. The logistics gap also extended to manpower. The U.S. had a population of 132 million in 1944, compared to Germany's 70 million. The U.S. military drafted 16 million men during the war, while Germany drafted 13 million. But Germany was fighting a two-front war, splitting its manpower between the eastern and western fronts. The U.S., by contrast, could focus most of its manpower on the western front. Morale was another factor. American soldiers were well-fed, well-equipped, and confident of victory. They knew that their country had the resources to win the war, and they had the support of the home front. German soldiers, by contrast, were hungry, poorly equipped, and increasingly aware that the war was lost. By December 1944, desertion rates in the Wehrmacht were soaring. Thousands of German soldiers were surrendering to the Allies, knowing that they would be treated better as prisoners of war than they would be as soldiers in a losing army. The combination of oil, manufacturing, supply lines, and manpower created a gap that Germany could never overcome. Peiper's discovery at Honsfeld was just a small glimpse of that gap, but it was enough to make him realize that the war was already lost. The Ardennes offensive was Hitler's last major gamble, and it failed spectacularly. By January 25, 1945, the Allied forces had pushed the Wehrmacht back to its original positions, ending the offensive. The German army had suffered 120,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and captured, lost 600 tanks, and consumed nearly all of its remaining fuel and ammunition. The U.S. had suffered 81,000 casualties, but it could replace those losses easily. Germany could not. The defeat in the Ardennes marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. With no more reserves to defend itself, the Wehrmacht was forced to retreat across the western and eastern fronts. In February 1945, the Allies launched a major offensive in the Rhineland, crossing the Rhine River in March. In the east, the Red Army captured Berlin in April. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. For Joachim Peiper, the end of the war brought a new kind of battle. In 1946, he was put on trial for war crimes committed during the Ardennes Offensive, specifically, the murder of 84 American prisoners of war at Malmedy. Peiper claimed that he had not ordered the killings, but he was convicted and sentenced to death. His sentence was later commuted to life in prison, and he was released in 1956. After his release, Peiper moved to France, where he worked as a translator and author. He wrote extensively about the Ardennes Offensive, and in interviews, he repeatedly emphasized the role that logistics had played in Germany's defeat. The war was lost not on the battlefield, but in the factories of America, he said. We could not compete with their production. We could not compete with their fuel. We were fighting a losing battle from the start. Peiper's life ended violently in 1976, when he was murdered by a group of French left-wing activists who accused him of war crimes. But his legacy as a soldier who understood the true nature of World War II endures. His realization at Honsfeld, that Germany's logistics crisis made victory impossible, was a truth that many of his superiors, including Hitler, refused to acknowledge until it was too late. Industrialism, and the future of war. The story of Peiper's discovery at Honsfeld is more than just a footnote in the history of the Ardennes Offensive, it is a powerful illustration of a fundamental truth about modern warfare: logistics wins wars. For centuries, military leaders had focused on tactics and strategy, but World War II proved that even the most brilliant strategy is useless without the supplies to back it up. Before World War II, logistics was seen as a supporting function, something that happened behind the scenes, not on the battlefield. But the war changed that. The size and scope of modern armies, with their tanks, planes, and trucks, meant that logistics became a strategic weapon in its own right. The side that could produce more fuel, more weapons, and more supplies would win, regardless of how clever its tactics were. The U.S. military understood this earlier than most. General George C. Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, once said, "Logistics is the lifeblood of an army. Without it, an army is just a mob of men with guns." Marshall made logistics a top priority, investing billions of dollars in factories, ports, and supply lines. The result was an army that could fight anywhere in the world, sustained by an endless stream of supplies. Germany, by contrast, never fully embraced the importance of logistics. Hitler and his generals were obsessed with tactical brilliance and Blitzkrieg, lightning war, but they ignored the mundane realities of fuel, ammunition, and transportation. They believed that victory could be achieved through courage and willpower alone, but World War II proved that courage and willpower are no match for an endless supply of gasoline and bullets. The Ardennes Offensive was also a clash between two worldviews, American industrialism and Nazi ideology. Hitler believed that the German master race was superior to the soft Americans, and that their ideological fervor would overcome America's material advantage. But the war proved that ideology cannot defeat industrialism. The U.S. did not win because its soldiers were braver or more committed, it won because it could produce more of everything. This clash has echoes in modern warfare. Today, nations still debate the balance between technology, industrial capacity, and ideological commitment. But the lesson of World War II remains clear: a nation that cannot sustain its military with the necessary supplies will eventually lose, no matter how strong its ideology. The discovery at Honsfeld has become a symbol of Germany's defeat in World War II. It is a reminder that wars are not won by single battles or brilliant commanders, they are won by the ability to produce, transport, and supply an army. For military historians, Honsfeld is a case study in the importance of logistics. For soldiers, it is a warning never to underestimate the enemy's ability to sustain itself. But Honsfeld is also a reminder of the human cost of war. The 50,000 gallons of gasoline that Peiper captured were not just numbers on a page, they were the product of millions of hours of work by American factory workers, the result of convoys that crossed the Atlantic under threat of U-boat attack, and the lifeline for thousands of American soldiers fighting to liberate Europe from Nazi tyranny. On a cold December day in 1944, Joachim Peiper stood in a field outside Honsfeld, Belgium, and stared at a mountain of gasoline drums. What he saw was more than just fuel, it was the truth. The truth that Germany could not compete with America's industrial might. The truth that the war was already lost. The Ardennes offensive was Hitler's last, desperate attempt to turn the tide of World War II, but it was doomed from the start. Germany's logistics crisis, its lack of oil, its crumbling supply lines, its inability to produce enough weapons and ammunition, made victory impossible. Peiper's discovery at Honsfeld just made that truth impossible to ignore. Today, the field outside Honsfeld is quiet. The fuel drums are long gone, and the scars of war have faded. But the lesson of that day remains. Wars are won not by courage alone, not by tactical brilliance alone, but by the ability to sustain an army with the supplies it needs to fight. The United States understood that lesson, and it won World War II. Germany did not, and it lost. As we look back on the Ardennes offensive, and on Peiper's fateful discovery, we are reminded of the words of General Omar Bradley, who commanded the U.S. First Army during the battle. The German soldier fought with courage, but courage is not enough. You need fuel, you need ammunition, you need supplies. The Americans had all of that. The Germans did not. That is why we won. The 50,000 gallons of gasoline at Honsfeld were not a victory for Germany. They were a eulogy. A eulogy for a nation that had gambled everything on a war it could never win. A eulogy for a dream of world domination that was crushed by the relentless power of American industrial might. And for Joachim Peiper, that eulogy was written in gasoline, gasoline that told the truth about the end of World War II.